Good morning and welcome to Mecca Live here on Tuesday, August 27th, 2020. This week's theme, trauma storage sites. Today's topic, these three boxes. Before we get started, I want to say a couple of things. One, I want to be sure that I'm clear that to send thoughts, prayers, and positive energy to those who are in the path of or are in some way facing these fires in California. We have a lot of friends and family out there. We want to make sure that they know that they're in our hearts and our minds. But then to also reach out. It's one thing to have thoughts and prayers. But it's another thing to demonstrate that you have care and concern and you're worried. I don't want to say worried, but you're concerned about their health and well-being. So if you have any family, friends, loved ones in that area, I'm sure many of you have already begun so, but if you haven't thought about it or you haven't been able to get around to it, please take a moment sometime today and reach out and see how everyone's doing out there. Also, those who are in the path of the two storms that were headed this way. Right now, we seem to be okay. We had a lot of storms and rain here in Southwest Florida yesterday. But right now, it seems okay. So I'm going to do another check shortly, but I wanted to put that out there because we have been talking about trauma thus far. And yesterday, I did mention the disaster in Western Virginia back in 1972. So keeping in mind that natural disasters and things of that nature can also impact and cause traumatic experiences and responses. So I want to say this before we get started. I'm going to share with you why I'm going to take this time and discuss trigger warnings. I want to let you know that if you're watching this and you have experienced any type of trauma in your life, here's your warning. We're going to get into some things today that in and of themselves may not necessarily be specific in nature in the sense of I'm talking about a specific topic or or specific type of trauma. But those of us who have had traumatic experiences, we know that there are certain things that it may not seem obvious as a trigger. So I want to make sure that I put that out there because we will be discussing some aspects of trauma, how we store it, and then some of the categories. So as we know, not everybody responds the same. Not every situation that I may feel as a trauma is one for someone else, and vice versa. So I want to be careful, and I want to be clear that we're going to talk about different categories and types. And so, and we know that sometimes just mentioning them can be enough to ignite someone's trauma. So I don't want to do that. I want to be responsible in that regard. I wanted to share that with you. Additionally, where I am in Southwest Florida, we do have several locations that have walk-in sites. If you're experiencing any type of crisis, specifically one of mental health or psychiatric in nature, and there's a range, right? So I wanted to be clear that I'm going to list a couple that are in the Southwest Florida area, but also for those of you who may be viewing in other states and other cities, to be mindful of the locations that correspond with your location. Here in Southwest Florida, we have Elite DNA, we have Salis Care, and we have a couple of others. But I wanted to mention those two because Salis Care has a crisis center, right? They have a crisis unit, where you may go, you may walk in or get dropped off, and if you're in crisis, they'll help you through that. We have some other locations. Park Royal, I think, is one of the mental health / psychiatric hospitals. I'm not quite sure on their walk-in availability, but I do know of Salis Care, and also Elite DNA has virtual immediate services. So if you find yourself in a place or space here in Southwest Florida where you are not sure, I'm feeling some kind of way, I want to make sure, that I want to know what's going on, but I'm not ready to say I need a therapist, right? A lot of people have said that to me, so I always recommend, well, then go to one of the centers. And now with COVID, I know for a fact, specifically because I've referred people to Elite DNA, I know that they have virtual services, virtual walk-in services, so you can look that up online. But if you are not in this area and you're curious or are unclear about what the resources are in your area, make sure you reach out to you can you can do a Google search, or you can reach out to several organizations that are helping in nature. So The Department of Children and Families can also guide you if you're like, I don't even know where to call, like I don't even know where to begin. That's a good resource. United Way is a good resource, and a lot of times that's a 211. I think that's the number. But if you do I feel like if you do a rudimentary search in your search engine, you'll be able to locate different services locally. So with that being said, I want to again remind you that I want to reinitiate the trigger warning so that you understand that there may be subject matter, not necessarily graphic or specific in nature, but because we'll be talking about different categories, I wanted to make sure that those of you who are watching that may have a history of trauma or unresolved trauma are able to access the information that they need and be mindful that I may talk about something that resonates with you. So be mindful of that. So today's topic is these three boxes. Yesterday we mentioned that we were going to discuss three types of trauma. That's acute trauma, chronic trauma, and complex trauma. So what I want to do is just unpack that quickly because the last thing many people want is someone to read to them. But I want to be specific with this because it's a weighty topic. And we talked about yesterday that many of us have and may experience some sort of traumatic experience in our lives in one fashion or the other. And we also discussed that what may seem to be a trauma to me may not be one for you. And it's not so much the thing, it's the reaction to the thing. So I want to be clear about that. But trauma has no boundaries. It can affect anyone regardless of age, race, nationality, gender, or whatever. It's not we may go through or witness or experience the same event, maybe even at the same time, but not all traumatic experiences are the same, and therefore not all responses are the same, and therefore not all strategies, are going to work across the board. And that's the overarching reason why the focus this week is trauma storage sites. So let's get right into it. What is acute trauma? So when we think about a single event, like a major thing or one thing that has happened in someone's life, we think of acute trauma. So that would be that could be a natural disaster, that could be a car accident, it could be a single assault, like being robbed, right, or mugged, or witnessing a violent event. An experience, an event that threatens. Again, we're going to go back to that safety and security. So one that threatens the individual's physical and or emotional safety. These are the experiences that they tend to and can. And I'm trying to be vague on purpose because not everybody. Well, that didn't happen to me, so maybe I didn't have an acute one. So I'm trying to keep both ends of the spectrum involved so that we know that it could be somewhere in the middle along the continuum. But they can have a lasting negative impact on one's psyche if they're not treated, right? If not addressed or unresolved. The impact can be across the lifespan, right? So again, the longevity of the impact directly correlates with if it's resolved or unresolved, if we seek any kind of help or even talk about it, right? Acute trauma is also sometimes connected with short-term post-traumatic stress disorder. So what am I talking about? Like if we have this acute trauma, what could the symptoms include? Here are some: severe panic or extreme anxiety, confusion and or irritation, disassociation or feelings of being disconnected with oneself and their surroundings. And sometimes some of us that are familiar with mental health and different diagnoses, this may sound like a couple of diagnoses. I don't want to say it out there because then people are going to say, right. Insomnia, suspiciousness, or acting strange or in strange ways. It may seem, some people may say they look paranoid, but although that's not one that's listed. Lack of self-care and poor grooming, loss of focus or productivity at work or at school. So it may not necessarily, you may see, well, I know someone has this, but keep looking, right? Just because these things are present doesn't mean that the person is experiencing some type of acute trauma, but it does raise the flag, right? It does put us in a position where we're going to pay a little bit more attention because something clearly isn't right, right? So we think about it in the sense of when we call the paramedics. We don't know everything that's happening. We just know something's not quite right over there. And somebody who knows what these things would look like and may be able to help this individual process what's going on. That's who we need to call, right? So if you see these types of things or you're experiencing these types of things, this is where we start. Like we look at the symptoms, right? Um, and sometimes, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you some examples and then I'm going to tell you some things that tend to help. But these are not an end all be all resolution to acute trauma. So immediate emotional support, right? So if you're that person on the scene, I'm here, what's going on? Are you okay? If you don't feel comfortable with that, again, find someone who does, find someone that you feel or they feel that maybe they don't want to talk to you, they want to talk, but not to you. So who is someone they feel comfortable talking to? Are there people around or at your disposal? That's why I mentioned some of the resources earlier that can be beneficial with this person who may or may not be in crisis. Removal from the scene of the trauma. So we know that, like I said, if it's an accident or a one-time kind of thing, let's step away from the situation. Short-term use of medication. Sometimes your doctor or your psychiatrist or your psychologist have a team, may be part of a team, a mental health team that may prescribe something short-term. What am I talking about? I know that when I worked in a different state, I had several in this one situation, I had several adults that were experiencing short-term, they called it short-term depression, but and it was situational, right? One was going through a divorce and one had experienced a death of someone close to them and it just could not. And so the psychiatrist that was on our team prescribed a mild antidepressant. So that's an example of short-term medication. Medication are natural strategies to combat insomnia. We know that there are different things that people can do with their lifestyle, eating, when they do their physical activity. I remember when I was in my early 20s, I still have sleep issues, but not the same. In my early to mid 20s, I had insomnia. It's very difficult for me to get to sleep, and so it wasn't too bad. I said that they were sleep cycles because it didn't last as long. Like it was it looked like insomnia, but when I looked up insomnia, it didn't fit the category, quite well. So I decided that I was going to call it sleep cycles because the way that it happened, right? So I said, one of the things that I changed was when I went to the gym. I would go early in the morning because I wanted to set my day, get started. I'm awake, let's go. And then when that sleep cycle would hit, where it was hard for me to go to sleep, then I switched it. I would go to work and then come after work, take my gym clothes with me, go to the gym, and then now that's changed my energy levels. Some of the chemicals have changed, and so some of those were some of the things that I did. So that's just an example. The second box, chronic trauma. So now we're going to explain what that is and what that may look like. So when we think of chronic trauma, we think of exposure to multiple types of trauma or prolonged, right? So chronic, repetitive. So what are we talking about? These types of traumas tend to be overwhelming, and the events or a period of time extend. So it's extended over a period of time. What are the examples? If we have someone who has a prolonged treatment, undergoing some type of treatment for illness, right? So we know that we have, maybe it's a chronic illness, or maybe they've had an accident, and so they have to have repeated surgeries to, like, maybe it's an accident, a vehicle accident, or maybe some kind of, we know that people that have been burned, like burn victims, have to have repeated surgeries. We know that can be a traumatic experience, especially if it's a result of a trauma, right? Domestic violence, childhood abuse, sexual abuse, exposure to combat situations, because this is prolonged, right? Chronic trauma can be made up of several instances of acute traumas. So remember we said acute is like a one-time kind of thing. Okay, but if I'm mugged and then I'm mugged again, here we go, right? So understand that they can interlock, they can be, happen simultaneously, or it may just be one thing and then that's it. And understanding that we don't always respond the same to our traumas. especially if they're like acute or chronic. Um, and sometimes when we have unrelated traumas that happen in close proximity. So there we go with the chronic. Those types of traumas can fit into that category of chronic. Leaving chronic traumas unresolved can have a long-term negative impact on the quality of one's life. And then the symptoms of chronic trauma. So the difference, one of the big differences between acute trauma and chronic trauma and how the symptoms present themselves, sometimes the symptoms of chronic trauma may not come to the surface, right? And they may not do so for an extended period of time. It depends on the trauma, it depends on the person, but that's one of the differences when we're looking at symptoms and some of the cases that involve and chronic and acute trauma. So with the chronic trauma, even years after the event, some long-term reactions of trauma can include unpredictable emotions, right? Flashbacks, anxiety, rage, physical symptoms like fatigue, headache, and nausea. And think about that for a second. If fatigue, I don't know why I'm so tired. There are many things. It could be blood sugar. It could be I didn't get enough sleep last night. It could be my body's fighting something. So you see how general and how broad some of these things are. So people don't just automatically jump to trauma. So that's how a lot of times it goes unresolved because, well, so that happened. So I'm okay. I'm alive. So I'm good. But then our bodies are like, you're not. We need help, right? Um, so fatigue, headaches, and nausea. Those are those are symptoms that can fit into many different categories, many different types of illnesses, and many different types of infections or diseases, or just um, if we have if we have like bronchitis or sinusitis or something along those lines. Like we have these different things, and some of these things fit into that, right? So be mindful of how varied and how broad some of these symptoms are, but also being mindful of the fact that keeping your mind open that, okay, well, we ruled out this, and this. What are we not looking at? Because sometimes we go and we get evaluated and it's like, okay, I got it. I don't have this, and this, so I'm fine. Well, I'm not because this keeps happening, right? Um, Sometimes the treatment inside chronic trauma would require or involve the care of a professional. However, when we look at that, we have to take the situation, the person's temperament, and the type of trauma into consideration as we think about the best fit. And we're going to talk about that later, probably because we're at 18 minutes. May be something we add into tomorrow's topic, how to best find the treatment modality, and the types of strategies that will work best with you, with your trauma, with your temperament and personality, right? But let's get into the third box, the complex trauma. So complex traumas result from exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events or experiences, often within the context of interpersonal relationships. So complex traumas, what are we talking about, right? Sometimes a person feels trapped. Sometimes it's between one or more people. Sometimes it's the result of something that's been planned and extreme, ongoing, and repetitive. So it sounds like abuse, like maybe domestic violence, maybe child abuse. Often often has more severe and persistent impacts. Involves challenges with shame, trust, and self-esteem. We're thinking about a lot of the young people in general, but specifically young people that have been and are involved with human trafficking. Um, and may involve the coping skills a lot of times when people have these types of complex traumas, alcohol, substance abuse, self-harm, overeating, undereating, affects emotional and physical health, overall well-being, relationships, and daily function. So, what when might this type of trauma occur? Complex traumas commonly occur with repetitive traumas against a child, and this can be especially damaging. I'm reading this because I want you to get this. Many situations can cause complex trauma in childhood, involving, including all forms of child abuse, neglect, adverse childhood experiences, community violence, domestic and family violence, civil unrest. I want to say that on purpose. civil unrest, war trauma or genocide, cultural dislocation, sexual exploitation, and trafficking. So I know that just living today, a lot of those things rang true just from what I've seen on the news, just from what's happened in the last several months, just since March of 2020. We're dealing with the pandemic, we're dealing with economic things, we're dealing with social unrest, and what in the world? How are we processing this? Let alone how are children processing this? And we're going to talk about children tomorrow. Um, so when we think about these three traumas and thinking about the type of help that would be required, or that's accessible, that for us to be mindful of, in the sense of, I don't want to continue living like this. Maybe, there's something I need to resolve. That's why we're having this conversation. So when we think of, I'm looking at the time, and I have a lot to cover, so I'm thinking I may add. I'm gonna stop prior to where I had planned to stop, because I want to make sure that we cover all the pieces. But we talked yesterday about post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic stress syndrome, and so I want to tell you the difference between a disorder and a syndrome. So when we think about a disorder, it's the disruption of regular bodily structure and function. So that's a disorder, and general disorder. I'm not speaking specifically to this, but generally a disorder disrupts the normal body function and or structure. When we have a syndrome, though, it's a collection. It's a collection of signs and symptoms associated with a specific health-related issue. Now, those are the broad general terms. Now we're talking about trauma. See the difference? One is here, one is hard and fast, and the other one kind of ebbs and flows. And that's why understanding the difference between a disorder and a syndrome is important and crucial as you look to ways to resolve it. You want to make sure that you put yourself or your loved one, or you explore the best possible treatment or support system as it relates to whether you or your loved one falls into the PTSD disorder or the PTSS syndrome capacity. And that's where the professionals come in handy, because they know the questions to ask and they know how to understand what you're saying when you're explaining your situation. So I remember yesterday I mentioned West Virginia. So I want to give you the information about that. It was February 26, 1972, Buffalo Creek flooded. And so that situation is, that natural disaster has been the most extensively examined and the longest followed study, right, as it relates to the psychiatric study of trauma. And so it's from that many of our theories and many of our viewpoints and perspectives along trauma began. A lot of it came there. Now, not to say that trauma didn't exist before that, but a lot of the research that's come from that, because they examined it and then they continued to interview and speak with the residents. They had this increment of time that they continued to meet with them, and then the people that were there when they were children, right? And then the children of the people that experienced the flood that left so many people homeless and so many people with lost loved ones and things of that nature. So it has been one of the longest studied natural disasters along the line of psychiatry as it relates to trauma. So my point is this: when we're looking at these things and we're like, okay, we have these different types of trauma, different ways to treat it. What happens when this happens? I want to also share one other thing, because it's a lot to unpack. And so I'm trying to be as broad and general as possible so that you have enough information to know which direction to go if you want to continue to dig, but then also to help people be aware. There's just so much out there. There's so many things happening, right? But I want to talk about this really quickly because we are approaching running out of time. And so I want to make sure that you understand a couple of things. One of the things we're going to talk about each day of this week is how and where we store unresolved trauma. So that I'm going to read this to you. So the energy of trauma is stored in our body's tissue, primarily muscles and fascia. That's that thin lining in between. Um, and it's stored there and it stays there until it's released. This stored trauma typically leads to pain and progressively erodes the body's health. Emotions are the vehicles the body relies on to find balance after a trauma. So if we remain in survival mode, we're going to tap out. We're going to tap out. And I don't know which part of our body will tap out soon, fast, first. I don't know if it's going to be our mentation. I don't know if it's going to be our physical body. I don't know if what it's going to be. But it's one thing to survive. It's another thing to thrive. And the distance between surviving and thriving is the help that you need, whatever that is, and however that looks. But I want to be clear that when we chronically repress emotions, now, again, this context is trauma, but emotions are broad, right? When we chronically repress emotions, we create toxicity in our body, in our minds, and in our hearts. This unprocessed emotional energy is stored in our organs, muscles, and tissues, just like I just said. Last thing I want to address, because people have said, is there such thing as trauma memory, right? I'm going to answer that by saying this. Our bodies remember trauma, quite literally sometimes. Our bodies remember trauma and abuse quite literally. The way in which we respond to different things, and here comes the point of triggers. The way we respond to new situations, the way we respond to different strategies, learned during moments of terrifying and life-threatening events, our bodies remember that, right? Sometimes, I remember when I was working in a mental health center several years ago in one of the states up north, someone came in, I was working with them on, I forget what their diagnosis was, but they just didn't see themselves that day. I'm like, is everything okay? I don't know, I just feel blah, blah, blah. I couldn't figure, I'm asking all these assessment type questions, and I'm exploring and active listening and, thinking back over our time together and the different things that we discussed and all the things they're working on. And it just hit me. I was like, could you be having an anniversary? And they were like, an anniversary? I was like, yeah, did something happen around this time at some point? And then they were like, oh my gosh. And then, yeah, like last year, around this time, I don't remember the exact date, but around this time. So if something like that can be remembered without us remembering here, absolutely. These things are stored in our bodies. So our bodies remember. A memory may ebb and flow, but our bodies will remember. So the therapeutic practice of addressing these types of things, the therapeutic supports and things of that nature that are available for us would, if it's something like that, like if we are, and like that, I mean, like the example I gave of the person that was like, yeah, if we are experiencing different things, we're not quite sure where it is, obviously you want to seek the help of a professional. At the same token though, if we're going to explore, like, why do I feel like this? Did I eat right today? So you have to understand where you are on that continuum, but understanding that there are people and there are organizations and there are support groups available. I understand support groups are generally free unless you are participating in a support group that it has been established with your therapist or your counselor or at a place. A lot of times there may be a nominal fee, but generally support groups are free. And the beauty of support groups or meeting in groups is that you are in a room full of people that are having or have had similar experiences. So that takes which is why isolation is one of the things that we try to address in a way that resonates with the individual, because then you're not getting, a lot of times, depending on the severity of the situation, then you're not getting what you need. And again, depending on the severity of the situation, you may just may stay in that cycle and keep replaying, or just stay stuck. And that's no way to live. Just to be blunt, that's no way to live. So we are at the 30-minute mark. I want to let you know what you can look forward to in the way of hope. There is hope with this whole trauma situation. There's hope as we think about the different situations that we see in the news and that many people are experiencing right now that can be traumatic. What I want to share with you right now is this. There's some other aspects to this that I wanted to share, but I'll share tomorrow because we are at the 30-minute mark. But there is hope. We will discuss the most beneficial ways to be physically active if you're processing or trying to process through or address traumas that have been unresolved. They're the most beneficial types of physical activity. Will speak to the role of mindfulness as it relates to processing trauma, the impact of isolation, like I just mentioned, and how to progress to process through isolation to FaceTime to real time, right? Um, the support part, like I mentioned before, whether it's your family, whether it's friends, whether it's other people with similar situations that you may know of, whether it's one-on-one treatment, if you're doing your virtual, I'm just going to reach out and say, hey, I saw this thing today on YouTube. I know that I've had this experience. I know that some of the things, I recognize this, and this. Can someone help me? It could be just like that. Or if you have family, friends, or loved ones that are well versed in trauma, I'm not suggesting that you utilize them for therapy or treatment, but they may be a good resource as to the direction to point you in that will best fit your needs. Um, so we're going to continue to explore and explain again. I think Thursday is when we get into this breathing, the role of breathing and how to breathe and what to do with that, how that helps so much, right? When we're dealing with these types of things. Vocal toning. We'll explain that. We'll explain sensory input, self-care, and various types of treatment and modalities and strategies that best fit your situation or that of your loved one. So I want to give you your at-home work, and I want to be sure that you understand and know the topic for tomorrow as we continue the trauma storage sites series for this week, theme for this week. So you have a choice for your at-home work. You can become actively involved. You can become actively available to someone that you know that has experienced trauma and that's processing through their trauma. But understand this: if that's the one that you choose, be sure that you have permission from them and that you follow their lead. It has to be someone that you have that relationship with, and just say, hey, I was watching this thing, and I just want to be more available. How can I be more available to you? Like, what if you are having a moment, or if you're triggered, or what? How can I best be? How can I best support you? And then how can I best be available? Right. So utilize them and follow their lead, and be available. They may need you at 3 a.m. So understand, establish that with the person. What does available mean to you? What does that look like to you? And then make that decision. You have another option for at-home work, and that is to take self-inventory. But understand that if you haven't begun this process, if you haven't started this work, that you let someone you trust know before you begin this. But all you would do with the self-inventory is make a list. What are the unresolved things? And when you write them, you may write it and say, well, that doesn't look like a trauma. It doesn't matter. Write a list of anything that's unresolved. And with that list, know that once you write it down, you got to put work in, right? So be mindful of the resources in your community. Be mindful of your interpersonal resources. Like I said, if you have a family member or loved one that's a mental health professional or has access to one that they trust, then make sure that you have that on deck, because now we're going to put work in. We make a list. We got to do something with the list, right? So tomorrow we will explore the tiny storage bins, right? The tiny storage boxes with heavy loads. The title for tomorrow will be The Tiny Storage Bins That Break. So the part that I wasn't able to cover today because we ran out of time, it's applicable for tomorrow's topic, and we'll just weave that in. But I want to be clear with you that dealing with trauma is not something that's light and frivolous. And it doesn't look like everybody. It doesn't have to look like everybody else's or someone else's trauma. It doesn't even have to be, even if you have the exact same type of incident or experience, one is not greater than the other because one is more violent or one is more long term. It just means that you both experience trauma, and your reaction is what determines it as a trauma, not the event. That's what I want to stress. All right, I'll see you tomorrow. Again, the topic tomorrow is when tiny storage bins break. Be kind to yourself that you may be kind to others, and as always, speak life. See you soon.